Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The ultimate cost-benefit analysis, assessing the so-called war on terror. After costing trillions of dollars, sacrificing personal freedoms, and ingratiating rent-seeking corporations, can anyone claim the U.S. and the world is any safer from the insidious plans of terrorists? And what is the difference between an act of terrorism and Western-style humanitarian intervention? To CrossTalk Terrorism versus Interventionism, I'm joined by John Glazer in Washington. He is a contributor to antiwar.com and a columnist with the Washington Times community section. And in New York, we cross to Max Abrams. He is a terrorism expert and fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. John in Washington, you first. Give me a cost-benefit analysis over the last 12 years. What's the balance? What's the ledger say?
Oh, it's almost all cost. The defense budgets and every other kind of budget in Washington has ballooned to, unprecedented degrees. The costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some estimates, when all the pays are due, it might end up being something like $4 or $5 trillion. And it hasn't benefited us in terms of security because the reasons that we were attacked on 9/11 remain and actually have been exacerbated. We still pepper the entire Middle East with military installations and bases. We still prop up autocratic dictatorships that terrorists view as apostates. We still support Israel overwhelmingly over the Palestinians, even as it carries out illegal activities in the occupied territories. And we've killed an immense, almost uncountable number of Muslims in the Arab world since 9/11. So we have not changed anything for the better, and we've only costed lives and money and treasure and blood.
Okay, Max, a lot said there. Do you want to reply to any of it?
Yeah, my colleague in Washington, D.C. left out an important point, and that is that we've killed not just innocent Muslim civilians, but I'm not sure if he's aware, we've also killed a very large number of terrorists themselves, including numerous senior al-Qaeda members, all the way from the top to low-level operatives. And the question that we should ask ourselves is not simply what has the United States achieved in the war on terrorism with its counterterrorism focus, but what have the terrorists themselves achieved? And so this morning, I went in through the Holland Tunnel, and I remember thinking to myself that al-Qaeda wanted to blow up this tunnel, but they didn't. And in fact, al-Qaeda's not blowing up much at all. And part of the reason why is because of the effectiveness of the drone campaign, which has really decimated the organization to virtually nothing. And so I think that it's extremely one-sided. It's demonstrably one-sided to say that the U.S. is unequivocally losing the war on terrorism when there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of terrorism, but we can indeed count many terrorist lives, which are no more.
John, would you like to reply to that? I mean, was it all this expenditure? Go ahead.
Losing or winning are sort of very bad terms to use in this context. We're not in a game. We're also not in a state-on-state war. We're not in a Cold War like we were with the Soviet Union. We are in a situation where the terrorist threat is low, as it has always been. 9/11 was a blip. It was a strange occurrence that probably couldn't happen again. It was a lot of luck, and it was out of the ordinary. If we look at the statistics prior to 9/11 and into today, there isn't much difference. That is to say, Americans are not really at risk of being killed by terrorists. It's a negligible, a statistical sort of tiny little minute thing that we don't even have to pay attention to compared to how many people die of heart disease or car accidents. And so, this has always been small. And the thing is that I'm not saying winning or losing. What I'm saying is that this is a small threat that we have responded to by putting ourselves into immense amounts of debt, getting our own soldiers killed, and killing far more civilians since 9/11 than we have core al-Qaeda people. Not only that, but we're,
actually, the numbers that you're stating simply aren't the case.
Excuse me, just let me finish. The rule of law is desperately at risk when the Obama administration
a few
claims
minutes
its
ago,
ability
and even RT's own numbers aren't consistent with what you're saying. To say that more civilians have been killed in the drone campaign than combatants, I don't think is just borne out by the statistical evidence. I'm sorry. And frankly, I do feel comfortable saying that there are some victories in the war on terrorism, and one of the victories is safety.
Okay, let's, gentlemen, John, no. We're talking about numbers here. John, I think
Peter,
the State Department gave some numbers for 2012, if I'm not mistaken.
The State Department numbers from 2012 say that 10 Americans were killed. 10 private Americans were killed by acts of terror in that entire year. None of them were in the United States. They were mostly in Afghanistan. One was in Iraq. This is not a threat that we need to be spending trillions of dollars to fight. Excuse me, can I finish a sentence?
Go ahead. John, finish your point. John, finish your point. Then we'll go to Max. Come on, Max, let's be fair. Fair time. Go ahead, finish your point, John.
He keeps mentioning this ratio of how many killed in the drone war versus civilians and how many core al-Qaeda. That's not what I was referring to begin with. I mean, I was talking about overall our policies in the Middle East since 9/11 have killed far more civilians than terrorists. I'm talking about the Iraq War, which reasonable estimates, peer-reviewed estimates, go higher than 650,000 people. If you think all of those were terrorists, you really need to go into a mental institution. I'm talking also about in Afghanistan. I'm talking about in Pakistan as well with the drone war. The drone war can easily be talked about in terms of how many terrorists we kill, but that obviously depends on whether you trust the government to say when a terrorist is killed or when some nameless, landless, civilian is killed. We know from the New York Times, for example, that the Obama administration considers everyone killed in the drone war to be a terrorist unless they're posthumously proven to be guilty of terrorism. And so, these numbers are a little bit untrustworthy.
All right, John,
but I grant him that.
I'm going to jump in here for fair time's sake. Go ahead, Max. Fair time. Go ahead.
Sure. When I say that there are some successes in the drone campaign, you need not take the word simply of the U.S. government. The terrorists themselves say that the drone campaign has been overwhelmingly effective in decimating their own organization. They say that they're on the run. They say that it's harder to be a terrorist. They say rely on Inspire magazine and make bombs in your mama's kitchen. Don't come back to Pakistan. Don't come back to these areas because it's unsafe for us now.
Max, they go to Syria now. They go to Syria.
Skeptical of the U.S. government, but
they go to Syria now. They go to Syria. Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, continue.
Go ahead, John.
Yes. So he's saying that the al-Qaeda people are scared of the drones. They're saying get out of Pakistan. One of the problems is that the civilian population is saying the exact same thing. They're living under a terrorist feeling every single day because they have these white little remote control planes flying over their head and bombing people when they gather for a wedding or a funeral or something like this. There have been a number of CIA officials, top CIA officials that are now retired, who have identified the drone war as one of the primary recruiting mechanisms for al-Qaeda because people become so angry that their relatives were killed, even if one al-Qaeda person was killed in the same bombing, that they say to themselves, I'm going to turn my sights on America now. That phenomenon is a fact.
All right, John,
that's happening
good point.
In Pakistan,
good point. Now let's go to Max. Let Max respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I have several things to say. I mean, when somebody says that they oppose the drone campaign, it's very important for them to come up with some kind of alternative instrument to deal with the terrorism threat. And so the alternative to the drone campaign is probably not doing nothing at all. It may well be, putting boots on the ground, which could be even more disruptive to civilian populations. I support the drone campaign not only because it's been so successful in decimating the senior al-Qaeda leadership and reducing the overall amount of terrorism, but also because, although tragic, that sometimes, we err and mistakenly kill civilians, the cost to that same population, to the civilian population, may well be higher with an alternative military response.
Okay, John, would you like to reply to that?
I have another alternative.
Blowback. Okay, go ahead. Alternative.
Al-Qaeda would disappear pretty quickly if we stole from them their main grievances, which help them propagandize and recruit. That is to say, if we stopped peppering the entire Middle East with U.S. military bases, if we stopped trying to control the oil resources, if we stopped propping up autocratic dictatorships, if we stopped unjustified support for Israel's illegal actions in Palestine. These are all policy prescriptions that are doable so long as there's political will in Washington, but they don't want to do it because they would have to be relinquishing their own power and control. So they are saying to themselves and to the American people, we will keep you at risk of al-Qaeda attacks.
All right, John, I have to jump in here. John and Max, I have to jump in. We're going to go into it. We're going to have a short break, and after a short break, we'll continue our discussion on terrorism. Stay with our team. Okay, Max in New York, before we went to the break, John gave a lot of prescriptions about policy, American policy in the Arab Middle East. Would you like to reply to that? Please do.
Yeah, I would. I think that the emphasis should be on the word "a lot." You look at bin Laden's fatwas in '96 and '98, and there are a lot of stated grievances. Now, John here in Washington is saying if only the United States were to, modify its foreign policy, make some concessions, then al-Qaeda would quickly, I think he used the word dry up or lose support somehow. The problem is that it's just a never-ending list of complaints about U.S. foreign policy, which are together impossible to mollify.
Are any of those grievances legitimate? Max, are any of those grievances legitimate in your mind? Any of them?
Yes, some of them are legitimate. One of the points that al-Qaeda has consistently stressed is that it wants the United States to reduce, if not entirely eliminate, the killing of Muslims around the world in these crusader wars, as they call them. Ironically, however, al-Qaeda terrorism has itself been responsible for a very large number of Muslim deaths. And of course, the terrorist attacks have provoked an aggressive counterterrorism policy, which, as John is quick to highlight, has had some very negative effects throughout the Muslim world, particularly on the civilian population. I also want to make an empirical point, however, and that is that even when terrorists are lucky enough to achieve their strategic demands, that doesn't mean that they then, go out of the terrorism business. Take Hezbollah, for example. Hezbollah was created in the early 1980s in order to get Israel out of southern Lebanon. Israel got out of southern Lebanon in 1984 and then entirely in 2000. And Hezbollah's stated political objectives simply changed. And so this is why the al-Qaeda expert Jessica Stern refers to al-Qaeda as having protean demands, because they consistently change with the wind, and it really makes making concessions
the West does that creates terrorism in the world. There's nothing the West does that creates terrorism in the world. Is that your position? Nothing.
No, I do think that there are certain actions that the U.S. can take and does, unfortunately, sometimes does in fact take, which are conducive to fanning terrorism. One of those would be foreign occupation. So I'm referring to the work of Robert Pape at the University of Chicago. I think having large numbers of boots on the ground in these Muslim countries irritates the local population and is conducive to growing the number of terrorist members and expanding the organization, and so that can be quite counterproductive. But again, that's an alternative strategy to the drone campaign, and that's precisely why I'm in support of the drone campaign, because the alternative of having boots on the ground is even less effective.
Okay, so John, as long as other people are killed and not our people, it's fine. That's the drone campaign in a nutshell.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of a sort of academic point, but I want to make it quickly and move on. You know, it's not about making concessions specifically to Al-Qaeda. They're not a cohesive body that we can make such concessions to. What I'm saying is that if we reevaluate our foreign policy to one that doesn't support dictatorship and Israeli occupation and consistently and persistently kill Muslims all around the Middle East, then we'll see the recruitment mechanisms for Al-Qaeda dry up, and then they'll be even weaker than they are now. What's happening now instead is that we have been, as Max has said, taking out the core Al-Qaeda, the senior leaderships, some of them at least, according to internal documents that have been reported upon, about 2% of all of those casualties in the drone war have been senior Al-Qaeda operational leaders. However, what we're doing is taking out some of the senior leadership and at the same time expanding the possibilities for the local population to start to sympathize with Al-Qaeda. This is happening in Pakistan and Yemen. So what I'm saying is if we reevaluate and stop killing people and stop supporting horrible authoritarian governments and stop supporting Israel, we will get to a point where the local population in the broader population in the Middle East won't feel the need to sympathize with Al-Qaeda, and they will lose their support base. This will make them eventually dissolve, and we won't have to kill innocent people in the drone war to do it.
Max, would you like to reply to that?
And it won't risk blowback
either.
Yeah,
I'm very happy to respond. I mean, if you listen to my fellow panelist John here, you would believe that the counterterrorism response of the United States after 9/11 happened without any provocation. But the reason why the United States is responding with such an aggressive counterterrorism response in the first place is precisely because there was terrorism which preceded it. And it's just not empirically accurate to say that if only the United States didn't respond in a heavy-handed fashion, there wouldn't be a terrorism threat. So in 1996, they blew up the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. The United States did very, very little. In 1998, there was the East African bombings. The United States did very little. In 2000, there was the Cole bombing. The United States did very little. In 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked for the first time. The United States did very little. And so there's a history of targeting Western targets and U.S. targets and international terrorism, which preceded this heavy-handed response. And so I don't think there's a strong empirical basis to say, well, if only the United States didn't respond in this fashion after 9/11, Al-Qaeda would go away, because it didn't go away before the United States acted that way.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Max, you misunderstand me. I'm not saying that solely the United States' response after 9/11 has contributed to more terrorism. What I'm saying is that U.S. policy since the Second World War has contributed and developed and generated terrorism. This is all blowback. It was blowback in the 1990s before George Bush and his crazy Iraq War, and before Obama, launched his drone war. That was a reaction as well. And you're talking about what preceded it. Let's talk about what U.S. policy preceded it. We supported the Saudi dictatorship and had military bases on their land. which pissed off a lot of people. We had been supporting Israel and its dispossession of the Palestinian lands for decades. And by the way, in the 90s, we were also the lead nation that was imposing horrible genocidal sanctions on Iraq that, according to the United Nations, might have killed about 1 million people as a direct result of the sanctions. So, I mean, this terrorism that you cited starting in 1996 was, in fact, a reaction to already standing U.S. policy that was killing immense amount of people and causing immense suffering among Middle Eastern people suffering under dictatorship. So look, we can always go back and back and back and back further and further, but the truth of the matter is that since World War II, we've had terrible policies towards the Middle East that have angered a lot of people and caused a lot of resentment.
Okay, Max, do you think the curbing of liberties at home, you know, is worth it, considering the war on terror? I mean, we can talk about the Middle East, but what about in the United States and Western countries, losing our freedoms in this conflict, if we can use that term? Is it worth it?
Yeah, sure. That's a very different kind of question, and my answer may actually surprise you. I do think that our counterterrorism response has been a little bit too heavy-handed in the sense of restricting civil liberties at home. I do agree with that. What I was saying is simply that we shouldn't, you know, be so partisan and so ideological as to say that there have been no benefits whatsoever to our counterterrorism response, because indeed there have been. At the same time, it's a valid question, as Peter points out, to ask, you know, given the fact that terrorism is not the foremost threat affecting the United States and indeed affecting almost any other country, is it worth it to sacrifice major things like freedom and liberty, et cetera? And so I'm actually very sympathetic to the think tank out of Washington, D.C. Called the Cato Institute. And they're always quick to point out how, you know, relatively small the terrorism threat is in comparison to other threats that affect the United States. And so I do think that a strong argument can be made, not that our counterterrorism response has achieved nothing, but that the costs simply haven't been worth it in other areas, like freedom.
You know, John, it seems to me this whole war on terror, we still use that term, it should be just dealt with police practices, okay? A crime is committed and you call the police. You treat it that way, not this international, global, you know, attempt to snuff out everything. It should be more precise.
Well, yeah, and I think that it's really an important question to ask why the government chose to go the global borderless war route as opposed to the police action route. I think there's a very good reason. In times of war, the government is able to expand its scope and power and control more than at any other time. So under a war footing, the United States government can throw habeas corpus out the window. Under a war footing, the United States government can illegally torture people. Under a war footing, the Fourth Amendment rights of millions and millions and millions of Americans can be eviscerated by an NSA that wants to collect all of our metadata and internet activity.
In the interest of fairness, I want to give Max the last 40 seconds in the program. Go ahead, Max.
Well, I've actually seen the statistics on the efficacy of various counterterrorism responses, in particular the difference between police responses versus military responses. Police responses, as you've correctly implied, are indeed correlated with a higher level of counterterrorism success than military responses are. That is to say, military responses are more likely to fail in the realm of counterterrorism than are police responses.
Well, on that very interesting point, Max. I'm sorry you didn't get to finish your point. Thank you, gentlemen. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.